There's a handful of questions, Mr. Milburn. The first is this. You explained the reasoning for providing a degree of financial assistance to VCJD sufferers by reference to the government having made assurances that meat was safe to consume. The inquiry is aware of both, first of all, evidence that in the context with which this inquiry is concerned, the government made statements to the effect that there was no conclusive proof that blood products transmitted AIDS, and has heard a range of evidence to suggest that patients were not being given complete or balanced information about the risks of treatment. First of all, were you aware of either of those two issues as part of the history?
I mean, in part, but I mean, obviously that's contested in part, I think. But the principal reason, you said, I think, the principal reason why there was the VCJD scheme was also about the nature of that particular disease and the fact that it was invariably fatal. It was fatal. Everybody who got it died. And I mean, thank heavens that wasn't always the case with hepatitis C, for example. So,
but should those matters that I've referred to have at least been part of the factual matrix presented to ministers for consideration of whether they took the decision-making over what you've described as a fine line, whether in relation to the provision of financial support or indeed questions as to whether there should be a public inquiry?
Well, I think if you go through all the documentation as I have, I mean, it's pretty obvious that these questions were continually being probed. It isn't that, ministers weren't asking questions, probing around what sort of support should be available. So Phil Hunt was asking questions of officials following, in fact, pre the Burton judgment about what further support should be made available for people with haemophilia, for example. And obviously after it, as we've been through during the course of the proceedings, questions were being asked by a range of ministers. John Hutton was asking questions. He was advocating questions around should social care packages of support be made available. They were exploring these issues. That was eventually referred to the hepatitis C strategy, which was published later. You saw the Yvette Cooper submission, which she'd requested, asking for optionality. So I don't think it's the case that in the light of either that judgment or the variant CJD decisions, that questions weren't being asked about what more could be done. They were.
I think my question was a slightly different one, which is not about what consideration was given to how government could respond. The question was, when deciding how government should respond, should the government have been considering the equivalent factual position to the position you were talking about in relation to VCJD, looking at what people have been told, looking at whether the government had been open, looking at whether patients knew about the risks, and been investigating those issues and seeing whether they provided a justification for measures such as financial support.
So I see that is a slightly different point. But that takes us back into the question that we were exploring, I think, just before the break, about how much it is possible to do that, given that the primary focus of ministers, obviously, is in the things that they're responsible for today, rather than the things that previous ministers had arguably been responsible for yesterday. And as I was suggesting, there's a limit, I think, to what it is possible for ministers to be able to do in that regard.
Lines to take for ministers or for the department are often or may sometimes be, let me put it that way, defences of government positions designed it in some respect to avoid criticism, and they can become entrenched over successive administrations. Are there any mechanisms that existed within the department when you were there to try and prevent that from happening, to try and ensure that long-standing positions were reviewed with a sceptical eye?
Yes, I mean, look, in the end, you know, the old adage applies, doesn't it, that officials advise and ministers decide. I think that is true, and I've always thought that that other adage, which you hear sometimes, might also be true, that, you know, it's weak ministers who blame civil servants. I think that might also be the case. So, you know, in part, as your earlier question was suggesting, that does come back to what it is possible for ministers to be able to probe. I'll give you one, it's a slightly fatuous example compared to the issues that we're dealing with here, but on the point about lines to take becoming entrenched, I remember when the very first health questions that I did in the House of Commons, which was a monthly event, when I was Minister of State and Frank was Secretary of State, obviously you get briefing for that and you assign certain questions to answer on the floor of the House. And to my astonishment, the briefing was all about the brilliance of the previous government's track record on the National Health Service. Well, it was pretty obvious that an incoming government, the last thing that it was going to do was praise the previous government. So that was a line to take, and it hadn't been altered. And so I obviously made my views known that I'd like a slightly different briefing to that one, and indeed a slightly different briefing then did occur and did for you know, for subsequent health questions. So I think it's right to say that lines to take do become entrenched and do get repeated, and you could see it in all of the copious briefings that I've looked at. You know, it's the same lines, there's a debate, the same lines, and so on and so forth. And this brings us back to this question about how it is possible to challenge that, and who has responsibility, and who has the space to be able to do that. And as I have said on a number of occasions, and I'm probably becoming rather repetitive and boring about it myself, is that it seems to me that the current mechanisms aren't always adequate in that regard.
And so would it be right to understand from that answer that at the time we're talking about, and it may well still be the position, but that's for later witnesses, there wasn't a mechanism, there wasn't a kind of panel or independent body or source, there wasn't a mechanism to challenge those entrenched lines to take other than ministers themselves?
Or officials, you know, either. And of course, it might be that some of the lines to take were right, you know, that you know, what had become established fact was actual fact. And of course, that would be contested. I understand that, and that's, you know, part of the problem with these issues, that there are different versions of what happened here, and that's why we're here today.
You referred in your earlier evidence to the broader implications in terms of essentially of precedent setting if financial support, ex gratia payments are made. Were you aware of any groups of patients unconnected to infection through blood who pointed to the Macfarlane Trust and the Eileen Trust and said, well, look, you've established that precedent, therefore we, in fact, damaged in some completely other unrelated way, not related to blood or blood products, should get ex gratia payments without having to prove fault?
I don't think I was aware specifically that the point of reference was the Macfarlane or Eileen Trusts, but you can see from the briefings that ministers received in submissions, that there were a number of groups that were highlighted. You know, there was the radiotherapy group, the myelin action group, potentially people who'd been caught up in the whole MMR debacle, etc. So I think, you know, I don't know whether those groups were particularly pointing to Macfarlane and Eileen as the sort of precedent that then they would want to have replicated, but it was pretty consistent in terms of what ministers were being told, that there was a potential cascade effect. I don't think that was the phrase that was used, but that's what officials meant. If we, and I think at one point, for example, I think Charles Lister made there was quite a searing phrase that he used about, you know, we can't just go on creating more and more precedents.
You referred to Alf Morris in earlier and his indefatigability. He was not alone in raising these issues, and indeed, as we've explored, you yourself had signed up to an early day motion whilst in opposition on the issue of compensation. Did you, as far as you can recall, ever talk to Alf Morris or any of the other MPs or members of the House of Lords who were prominently and repeatedly raising their concerns on these issues, to find out why they were convinced that there was something so serious, so profound, so exceptional here, that something needed to be done?
I didn't personally, but obviously Phil did. Phil Hunt was in a continual dialogue, both, I guess, on the floor of the House and then probably, I'm guessing, because I don't know, probably informally with Alf and with others. So those issues, as you can see from all the transcripts of the House of Lords debates, were very open. It was ongoing. Indefatigable is the right word. He was an amazing campaigner, Alf, not just as the president of the Haemophilia Society, but you know, for very many other causes, and was unrelenting. I guess part of the reason that we're here today is part of his legacy.
When I asked you earlier about public inquiry, you suggested that the how was known. It might be said that's a somewhat simplistic and oversimplistic way of looking at it. The how was known in the very crude and basic sense that infection was transmitted through blood products and blood. But there are a whole range of questions underpinning that, as, for example, how did it come to be that treatments were licensed by the UK licensing authorities that carried a fatal virus? How did it come to be that children were being given in the residential school Trelaws treatments potentially in excess of what they knew and without what they needed and without their parents being told the risks? I mean, there's a multiplicity of how questions, it might be said, that your answer oversimplified. Would you accept that? Do you have any further comment on that?
I mean, some of the detail that you're talking about, I'm not, I'm not even today aware of. So, forgive me if you think it's an oversimplification, but I had understood that the broad thrust of what had happened was understood.
You accept that there's what Council originally asked you in the course of her questioning was how in hell did this happen? Now that expression, how in hell did it happen, is really asking not for the mechanism, how, but the reason, the cause, how. And that, I think, is exactly the same sense. There is a difference between the cause, properly understood, and the mechanism by which the cause has effect.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable point.
I asked you earlier about the problem that might, or the problems that might develop where the very government department that might be open to criticism if there were a public inquiry is repeatedly saying there was no wrongdoing, the information's in the public domain. Do you agree there should be an independent body to decide when a public inquiry should be held, to avoid the situation where the impugned department is allowed to be judge and jury in its own cause?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one that I haven't thought about. I mean, of course, it isn't always the case that the impugned department, or the responsible department, let's call it that, resists a public inquiry. So, you know, I set up public inquiries of my own, so, you know, it is possible to be both judge and jury, so to speak. I think what is clear, I'd need to think more about that, but I think what is clear is that the criteria, even today, I mean, certainly the criteria for establishing a public inquiry in my day, I think were non-existent. Not even precedent created the criteria for when a public inquiry should be held, and even after the public inquiry legislation, I think from the mid-2000s, criteria are still pretty non-existent or woolly. So I think there is certainly something that could be done. And this would certainly help my cause, for example, on this question of health inequalities, which I'm passionate about. I think it would be helpful if there was clarification of when a public inquiry should be determined. Who decides? I think that's a different issue, and I think I'd need to think more about that. So and I think also, just a final point, I think it's also important that, you know, public inquiries, you know, they should be relatively rare events because they should be dealing with really big ticket items like this one is. And I think one would need to be clear, both in the terms of the criteria and in terms of the decision making, that they were just that.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from the questions that have been put forward to me. Just going to check with Ms. Gray. No questions. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Most of them have been asked and answered, but just a couple of questions. How best does a Department of State best learn and then apply the lessons of its own history or the history of that for which it is accountable? What system or process is necessary to enable it to do so?
I think it's a very, very important question. I think part of the answer lies in transparency. In other words, that when things have gone wrong, and by the way, in public policy, things can quite often go wrong, and if you interrogate hard enough, you'd find that probably mainly some things do go wrong. So I think, and this is the value of a public inquiry in a sense, that becomes a very transparent thing in terms of the recommendations, and generally ministers or the department responds openly and transparently to the recommendations that a public inquiry has made. What I don't know is what follow-up there is. So, for example, an inquiry with which I suspect we're both quite familiar, the Kennedy inquiry into Bristol, and I was referring to it earlier. I think I'm right in saying that it made a recommendation around no-fault compensation, which in the end was something that the government rejected following Liam Donaldson's report. What follow-up there has been to that, I'm really not aware, and I don't know whether a mechanism currently exists for doing that. So I think there's something around whether our transparency mechanisms are sufficiently finely honed, and whether they are more than one-offs. In other words, a report is produced, a response is produced, and that's the end of the matter, but no one goes back to it. I think, secondly, I do think this is where the role of the civil service, in the end, it is what it is described on the tin. It's a permanent civil service. It's not a coincidence that the official leader of the department is called the permanent secretary, unlike the ministers who come and go. So at the heart of what the civil service should be doing is really embedding that question around how lessons can be learned. And again, I don't think that is probably sufficiently embedded in what is expected of civil servants. And so maybe that is something in terms of the civil service code that one could think about. Because there's a, as you know, there's a code according to which civil servants and the service itself is supposed to operate. And the final thing that I can think of the top of my head, I'll think more about it, is that external scrutiny is very, very important in all of this, you know, and ensuring that questions continue to be asked, because you can't always assume that people who are leading incredibly busy lives with lots of stuff to do are necessarily always focusing on the lessons learned point. I mean, as I said earlier in answer to council, I think, you know, one of the things that I was very pleased about in terms of the handling of variant CJD, although I don't think it was explicit at the time, is that it seemed to me that when I looked at the lessons from the infected blood issues, I could see how there was read across into how issues were handled internally, and frankly, the responses that ministers were making. That shouldn't have to rely on luck or the happenstance of who is in office at which particular point. So there's something about how we institutionalise those learnings.
Well, that's what I'm asking about. Because civil servants, they may be permanent in name, but there is the next permanent secretary after the one before, and there's one after him or her. So the question is what system should there be, and
what did you have in mind?
Well, I don't. I'm asking. I'm asking you because of your reflective answers earlier, and because it's a slightly different question from how best you understand what the history has actually been, as opposed to that which it's currently accepted it was.
Warden, you know, I don't want to give you an off the cuff because it's a very important and
by all means, don't. By all means, you can think about it.
Well,
and
let me
write into the inquiry.
Let me give you an off the cuff, which I may come to regret. I don't know. But I was asked earlier about this question of what, as an incoming minister, what are you briefed about? And I think it is slightly different when you're reshuffled, as distinct from when a general election happens, and particularly when there's a change of government, change of political party in charge of the government. And I do wonder whether, as part of the incoming minister's briefing and assimilation, there shouldn't be something around, you should be aware of, these have been events that have happened, these have been wrongs that have committed, these have been faults that have identified, and these are the lessons that the department has sought to learn. Because then it's on the minister's radar and not just on the civil servant's radar. So I don't think the answer, Sir Brian, lies in one single lever that one pulls. This is about trying to inculcate a culture of continual learning. And maybe, second off the cuff, is maybe that there are some lessons that can be applied from, again, Liam Donaldson's rather brilliant work about how mistakes can be avoided, particularly when in clinical practice. You know, how you institutionalise and make possible a culture of learning rather than of blame. And of course that fundamentally is what lay behind Liam's proposals in terms of the reform of the clinical negligence system, because what he wanted was to, in a sense, to make it easier for doctors to be able to report mistakes and then to learn from them and act on them. So off the cuff, those would be two means of institutionalising, but I'm sure there are others.
Yes, well, thank you for that. If you have further thoughts on this, then please let the inquiry know, and we will institutionalise it as we have to do by sending a Rule 9 saying, please tell us. But you have a public invitation to do so should you wish, should you have further thoughts, because it's something which you may need to reflect on out of your own experience and knowledge of how the system works. Bearing in mind that the Minister is ultimately accountable, and not just for what he is doing now, but for what he's not doing, or she, because they are the head of the department. If it may be that the bedpan in Tony Pandy may not be something which he or she knows about, but it's something which, in that famous phrase, is something for which he is ultimately responsible.
Indeed, and I think I make that point in my written statement, that in the world of realpolitik, it's very, very difficult to be across every single item that crosses every minister's, still less every civil servant's desks. But
which is why I ask about systems.
Yes, exactly. But also in the world of accountability, one accepts that as the political leader of the department, which is what I was in my time as Secretary of State, in the end, you bear the responsibility and you bear the accountability, and indeed you're accountable to Parliament, because parliamentarians quite reasonably can ask you about anything. And so, yes, so that is I think that's a good constitutional convention, but I think this question of how you institutionalise learning is a really very important one.
Thank you. The second question is really rather different. It just occurs to me from what you've said about Phil Hunt, Lord Hunt, is to ask, do you think he was rather more sympathetic to the idea of providing compensation for those with hepatitis C than you were at the time?
Not that I'm aware of. I do.
Well, in that case, that's an answer to the question.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of.
Mr. Milburn, is there anything that you would wish to add?
I think probably you've had quite enough for me for today. I wish the inquiry well.
Well, thank you at least for wishing the inquiry well, even though it may never have existed had you had your way. But can I thank you for your evidence? It has been at times, many times, quite riveting to hear how you saw things and put things and your reflections upon it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So tomorrow we have the evidence of Andy Burnham.
Yes.